Hey guys, welcome back for another lesson on AP US government. Today we're going to be diving into Chapter 4, American Political Culture, and we're going to be exploring some of the values that we all share, at least to some degree, as American people. So, a quick look at our learning targets. We're going to talk about what in the world political culture is and what are some of the key components here in the United States. We'll talk then about how we differ from other countries. We call this comparative government. So, looking at the expectations and norms in other countries versus the United States. We'll talk a little bit about where political culture may have come from and what are some sort of battlegrounds in our political culture. All right, so here's our guiding questions, and I'd like you to take a minute if you're watching the video to pause it here and jot down some of your own thoughts on these questions. What are the things that you already know? And then resume me and we'll follow up, right? So, what do we already know about question one? Do Americans trust their government? Well, we've talked about this already. We say that trust in government and government institutions has fallen since the 1950s. That's based on public opinion polling. But likewise, in public opinion polling, many Americans still say that they trust the system of government, not necessarily the people, but the system. And according to public opinion polling, Americans display a much higher level of patriotism than other similar nations. That is pride in one's country. So this leads me to a secondary question here that's more about our economic culture than it is our political culture. And so the question is, why do we accept great differences in wealth and income? We have one of the larger income gaps in the developed world. Why are we okay with that? And one of the core tenets that we're going to talk about as a value of American political culture, as well as sort of our economic culture, is this belief in freedom and equality of opportunity, not necessarily equality of results. And so we have equal opportunity programs in place, say like education, K through 12 education is an equal opportunity program to get everyone on a level playing field. Everyone's able to read, write, hopefully contribute to the economy in a meaningful way. But it doesn't all mean that we're going to take home the same paycheck at the end of the day, right? So we set up a system based on equality of opportunity, not equality of results. That ultimately leads to differences in wealth and income. And then the final question is, why does our government behave differently than countries that have very similar constitutions? And there's a number of them, right? We said when we wrote our constitution, we were trying a lot of things for the first time, but a lot of other countries have since adopted a lot of those ideals. And so if we have similar constitutions, why do we govern so differently? And we'll talk about some of those examples of how and maybe why we govern differently. But ultimately, the why is our political culture. We have a difference in shared political values. We tend to see more tolerance and greater respect for orderly procedures, a huge emphasis on personal rights that is not found in other nations with similar constitutions. And I think a great example of this is I think you could ask a grade schooler about their rights, and they would be able to name one of them. So we've talked about rights, we've mentioned freedom, we've mentioned equality of opportunity and respect for order. All of these things are sort of elements of our political culture. And I've used that word a lot, but I haven't defined it yet for you. So, your political culture is your patterned or sustained way of thinking about how political and economic life ought to be carried out. And much of this is generational, right? Like I learned this from my parents and they learned it from their parents and we learn it in school, right? We learn a lot of those kind of key values of American political culture from an early age. We celebrate the 4th of July, right? And you have freedom and liberty and everything kind of sprinkled everywhere. So this is ingrained in us from an early age. And some examples here, Americans value political equality. We'll talk about equality as one of the tenets. And in a politically equal society, citizens who are unequal socially or financially still possess identical or similar voting rights and have the right to equitable treatment under the law. And we have some safeguards in place for that, the 14th Amendment and its Equal Protection Clause being one of those things that comes out of the Civil War, where prior we're certainly not treating certain sects of the population as political equals, right? The other interesting thing about the American political system and political culture is that in many ways it's our values that tie us together. We've always said America is sort of a melting pot, right? And so we don't all have a shared heritage or a shared skin color, right? Or shared life experience or any of those things. But in order for government to work long term, you need to have some things that unite us. And so these values might be some of those things. There's plenty of examples both in past history and more recent history of us trying to instill these values. And the example here is at the height of immigration to this country at the turn of the 20th century, there's this striking emphasis on creating shared political culture. And so school children across the country, regardless of their national origin, are taught to salute the flag, and the Pledge of Allegiance is developed, which we've seen obviously come back into schools more frequently as of late. And so there are ways that we have tried to instill political culture, for better or for worse, from a young age. And this is just one example. So in your note packet, I want you to think a little bit about what Americanism means to you. What's it mean to be an American? And jot down some of those ideas, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the core values of our political system. The way your book defines Americanism is the allegiance to the traditions and the institutions and the ideals of the United States. And these are the 5 ideals listed. The first being individual responsibility, that we are individually responsible for one's own actions and well-being. And you have democracy, right? And the idea behind democracy is that the people rule, right? So officials should be held accountable to the people, whether it be through the system of elections, um, or any sort of structure or system within governing. Then you have equality. And I mentioned that this means political equality, right? An equal vote, an equal chance to participate, a equal representation under the law, right? Or equal application of the law. We'll talk a little bit about how we view equality differently in the economic system as a review in a minute. Liberty, we perhaps think is synonymous with freedom, right? Freedom to do as you please. Your life being free from obtrusive government intervention. That would be another example of liberty. And then we have civic duty. And our founders were people who lived this out, right? Civic duty means that you should be a part of your community, that you should take a part in its affairs, and that you should help out and make the world a better place. And some of us do that better than others, but it was important to our founders, and it is a really important piece of a long-standing democracy. Now, how do we know that Americans actually share these beliefs? Well, there's no true way to prove it, and chances are we can't all agree on everything. But for the modern era, our focus is on public opinion polling. We ask samples of people how they feel about things and then statisticians analyze the data and they tell us these are the things that people tend to agree on. Right? But prior to public opinion polling, our assumptions are based on research on the types of books people read, the types of speeches that are well known, and how people responded to them. You can find newspaper accounts of how people responded to certain speeches that were given, the political choices that we make, right? These are the types of things that we consider in addition to the modern public opinion polling that exists today. We'll talk about how that public opinion polling happens in the next chapter. Now, obviously, there have been times in history where we don't live out these beliefs. And so I want you to think about how we can explain the existence of that behavior that's obviously in conflict with our beliefs of equality and democracy and liberty and all of those things. And ultimately, the example I give here is, if we believe in political equality, why did we deny votes to African American voters for 100 years after the Civil War? Right? How can we explain that type of behavior? And ultimately, we're still human and we act on self-interest. And our founders recognized that as well, that we would be selfish and corruptible. Social circumstances at the time, they change, right? What is okay and what is not okay tend to change over time as well. And we always, as humans, are grappling with this idea of creed versus behavior. So my creed is, this is my creed. This is the stuff I believe in. These are the values I want to live out. But I'm human and I make mistakes and I'm selfish, and you know, I don't go to that town meeting and practice my civic duty because I'd rather be watching a new TV show, right? So we can believe in things and not always act on them. And that's a very human reality. Right now, why has there been so much political conflict in our history if we agree on these big things? And we can say these are big things to agree on, right? And ultimately, the source of a lot of our conflict comes down to policy, not necessarily values. So it might be, a Second Amendment type policy, right? Gun legislation. And the way we interpret the freedom given under the Second Amendment may vary. And so we have disputes about that policy. We also can't have all of these. We can't do all of these perfectly. For example, sometimes the equality of everybody is at the expense of one person's liberty, or vice versa, right? So sometimes the values themselves conflict. We can't do them all perfectly. Now, we judge our economic system by really similar standards, the biggest difference being in how we define equality. So we said we insist on political equality under our political culture, but when it comes to the economic system, equality to us doesn't mean everyone is equal, everyone gets the same paycheck. What it means to us is, we support economic individualism, that individual responsibility is really the core tenet of our economic system. And that will mean that individualism is at the expense of true equality. We tolerate economic inequality. Now, that being said, we still put programs into place to support equal opportunity. And I mentioned K through 12 education as an example of that. We also tend to like the government to be a little bit more hands-off than maybe other similar democracies. The example here I have as sort of an example of how we favor economic opportunity but not economic equality is, generally in public opinion polling, Americans support the K through 12 education system as an opportunity to get ahead and to be on a level playing field. But they don't support policy like hiring quotas, or affirmative action programs are much more controversial, where I have to hire a certain number of people or admit a certain number of people based on their race, their gender, so on and so forth. So the name for our economic system, and really the economic system that makes sense for a country that supports economic individualism and personal responsibility as the priority goals within their system, is capitalism. And capitalism is the economic and political system in which the country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners that work for profit rather than by the state. And so individuals choose to make businesses, and if their business is profitable, they make money. That's the driving force for them. So, how do we compare to other nations? First, in terms of our political system, the public opinion polling finds that Americans generally exhibit a stronger sense of civic duty, a stronger sense of civic competence, and more confidence in our public and private institutions. Also, as I previously mentioned, a higher degree of patriotism, as you notice by this guy's nice suit. You can see here some of the data that that sort of summary is pulled from. You can see the statements on the bottom and then the comparison of public opinion data across countries. So when it comes to patriotism, you see that first statement. I'm very proud to be a member of my country. You can see 71% of Americans responded favorably to that prompt, in stark contrast to 21% of Germans. When it comes to economic individualism, we're looking at success in life is determined by forces outside of our control. You see, a lot of other countries have much higher numbers than us in regards to that attitude. So, great example of how we support economic individualism, this idea that it's on you to make life happen for you, right? In stark contrast to some of those other countries. You see, their children should be taught the value of hard work. And then what we're going to talk about later in the lecture is the role of religion, the civic role of religion. And you can see that the United States is much more religious than other countries with similar constitutions. The final statement behind my head here is it is necessary to believe in a God to be moral. So before I move on to the civic role of religion, I want to quick summarize the economic system and how we compare to other nations. So generally, based on the polling, Americans support equality of opportunity over equality of results, no limits on income, and our taxation system also tends to be more favorable to higher incomes than other nations with similar constitutions, meaning we have lower tax rates on wealthier individuals and businesses than other similar nations. And freedom and economic individualism really are the priority goals in the economic system, more so than equality or duty or democracy. So then when it comes to the civic role of religion, I mentioned that the US is amongst the most religious of nations. And we can say we have separation of church and state, but ultimately religion does affect our politics, and it has from the beginning, right? So the First Great Awakening, that early time period when we start to break with England, it's religious ideas and religious leaders that lead these colonial governments. Um, we mention God in many of these founding documents. Many of our founders are deeply religious, and we talk about the British violating the laws of nature's God, right? So these things work their way in. The abolitionist movement, right? The move for the end of slavery. Religious leaders in the enslaved population are core to moving this issue forward. Likewise, the temperance movement, the abolition of alcohol, same thing. fueled by religious ideas and religious leaders. We can say the same of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, led by people like Dr. King, who was a pastor, right? So it's led by a lot of religious leaders within the Black community and Black churches. The Christian Coalition I have mentioned here comes about around the Reagan era. And this is where ultimately interest groups start forming that are religious in nature and like wear that proudly, right? So of course interest groups have always been influenced by their creed, their values, their morals, their religion. But the Christian Coalition was like the first major interest group to be forward about advocating for changes to bills or to legislation in a way that it would fall in line with their religious agenda, right? Their outright goal was advance the religious agenda in politics, advance the Christian agenda in politics. And they produced voter guides, they lobbied the Reagan administration, and they interest groups like them continue to be influential in the political process. And sometimes they benefit from that lobbying. One example of that is public funding for faith-based nonprofits. And so we recognize the good that a lot of faith-based organizations do in our communities, um, helping feed the hungry and house the homeless and all of those things. And if they weren't doing it, the government would probably have to do it, or they would certainly deal with the repercussions of it. And so there is some public funding for these faith-based nonprofits that provide social services in our communities. So what are some of the sources of political culture? Like, where do we get these ideas? Where do they come from? Where do they conflict? That's what this slide is going to focus on. And one of the major balancing acts that we've had since the very beginning is this idea of how do we balance personal liberty versus social control? And like I said, it's a continued struggle from the founders. How do we give you the most liberty we possibly can, while also making sure our society is secure and just and all of those things? And you can think of a lot of examples of public policy debates today that come down to this issue yet. I think of something like gun control. How much liberty can we allow? And is that at the expense of safety, right? Safety in public schools, safety in public spaces. And so you have differing points of view on that idea of freedom when it comes to this sort of issue, right? And then we have in the United States sort of uniquely an absence of class consciousness. Class consciousness is the belief that you're a member of an economic group whose interests are opposed to people in other groups. Well, in the United States, we have this huge wealth gap. But like the vast majority of people will tell you that they're middle class. They could say they're middle class and have a household income of $60,000 per year. They could say they're middle class and have a household income of 300,000 per year. And we all still say, yeah, we're middle class, right? Even though those are vastly different standards of living, especially depending on where you're living. So that creates sort of a lack of uniformity on economic viewpoints, um, because obviously tax policy that helps those that say they're in the middle class but they're on the bottom end of household earning might be opposed to policy that protects those on the upper end that still claim to be middle class. So it creates unique debates around economic policy. Ultimately, the only thing we tend to agree on is that there is a 1% that makes a whole lot more than the rest of us do. But other than that, we really don't divide ourselves into social class and therefore against each other based on social class. What's more prominent in US politics is something we call a culture war. And there's a lot of culture war issues. I think of them as sort of the hot button issues that are really divisive. And a lot of culture war issues come down to orthodox versus progressive beliefs. And orthodox are like more traditional beliefs, beliefs that morality and religion have to be the decisive pieces, where progressive beliefs are the beliefs that personal freedom and modern social programs and problems are more important than maybe morality. And so the best example I think of as a culture war issue right now is abortion. Right, abortion, there's obviously the more progressive beliefs that it should be about individual freedom or bodily autonomy or whatever title you want to put on that. And then the more orthodox belief that is moved by one's own view about whether abortion is right or wrong and the morality and the religious beliefs behind that as well. But there's a lot of issues that are culture war issues. I think of a lot of LGBTQ um, legislation tends to be a culture war issue. Even immigration in ways is a culture war issue. So I think of these as sort of the hot button issues that many of us mentioned back in chapter 1. Now, one of the major challenges that we need to overcome really is the mistrust of government. And trust in government is declining. We said that early on, and this is some of the statistics on that. As of 2021, only 12% of Americans had trust in Congress. They were the least trustworthy of branches. So that's a problem, right? Because we don't trust our politicians to be working for us. However, the trust in the system of government tends to remain the same. So we don't seem to have this idea that we should, just scratch it all and start over. That sounds messy. I really hope I'm not around for that, right? Um, so 1 in 10 Americans trust Congress to do their job, but we still trust that Congress is the right structure to do the job. So how do we fix that, right? That is a challenge. Trust in institutions in general is on the decline. You can see newspapers, for example, are down to 21% of Americans that trust them. Um, Unions, 25%. Businesses, 18%. Congress, 12%. But then in stark contrast, the military, 69%, right? So when we can't trust these institutions or we can't trust the media and the example of the newspapers, we start to lose sort of a common story, a common thing that we can all understand to be true, to be fact. This is the more updated example that goes through 2020. You can see here the breakdown by institution, and as I said, it's a problem, right? And so the question is, has this mistrust in government led to a decline in civil society? So he said civic duty, it's important. It's important. But less people are doing it, less people are engaged. And is that connected to mistrust in these institutions? Many authors and political scientists say, yeah, civil society is vulnerable. Mistrust in government is linked to declines in social and civic engagement. Americans are bowling alone, meaning they're socializing less. They're doing less with organized religions, organized charities, organized political parties, and government. So this book, Bowling Alone, was written by Robert Putnam, and he looked at how are Americans participating in civic duty, right? What are they doing to get civically engaged? What are they doing to engage with their community? And that community could just be their friends, just be their family, right? And so ultimately, he looked at 40 indicators of what he called civic health, and it was stuff like membership in groups, trust in other people. Do you trust your neighbor to go let your dogs out? Those types of questions. How often do you connect with family and friends? Are you following the news? What's your trust of government? And he generally found that civic society, according to these indicators, is on the decline. You can see his health index here from about when his book came out. This ends in 2002. But the evidence, certainly as of more recently, is kind of mixed, right? And so I want to talk a little bit about the 2021 Civic Health Index and what that tended to find. You can see the summary on the screen here. They said most trends, most traditional ways of getting involved in civic life and civic duty are still on the decline. That there's less civic education, there's less community group membership, whether that be in your churches or your unions or your local political parties, that there's less trust in government yet. And so they said that's the bad news, right? But at the same time, the 2021 survey found that there were increased rates in things like volunteering and voting. The 2020 election saw some of the highest turnout rates in modern history, and 2024 was not all that different. So people are showing up to vote, they're volunteering in their communities, and they're actively engaging through protests as well. And we've seen plenty of those protests, whether they be Black Lives Matter protests or No Kings protests or the like, right? So the question that they leave us off with then is, well, is how we engage in politics changing? Is it actually not getting worse? Is it just changing? Do new generations have a new way of getting involved in this process? I'd be curious what you guys think about that. Now, many of the indicators that Robert Putnam used were based on this idea that these types of activities, these types of organizations, build the foundational skills for democracy. That democracy requires civic tolerance. It requires us to make space for and to listen to other people and consider different ideas. And if we're not doing that anymore, if we're not, talking to our uncle that we disagree with, or we're not going to community meetings where there's gonna be people that we disagree with, well, then are we losing the foundational skills for democracy? So democracy relies on free discussion of ideas, free selection of leaders. We generally have no agreement on intolerance, which is a good thing. Like, we're not just ostracizing one part of the population as a whole. Many times, someone's intolerance can be another's display of civic concern. So, an issue that I really care about, you may hate. You may hate that that's my position on my issue, but you might care about another issue that I really don't like, right? That I really don't have a preference for. So we at least don't agree on our dislikes, which is a good thing for democracy. And then democracy requires that we can count on our courts to enforce constitutional protections, that they continue to uphold the Constitution, and that they continue to be isolated and insulated from the impact of public opinion. Now, we know that most Americans may believe in these principles. However, in concrete cases, many of us are not as tolerant of groups that we disagree with. So we may say, yes, we agree in free meeting space. If a community group wants to hold a meeting, regardless of their political affiliation, they should be able to hold the meeting. But if we give a more specific scenario and we say, you manage a public building and you're pro-life, are you going to let a pro-choice group come in and run a meeting in your space? Right? Well, you're managing a public building, so you have to, but you might not like it, right? And that's the example of where, in the hypothetical, we tend to agree, yeah, we should allow public meeting space. But in the concrete, we don't like that it's actually happening. We don't like to make space for those who disagree with us. Okay. Now, there have been times in history where we have agreed on an intolerance. For example, if you think of the Red Scare, communists were like public enemy number one, disliked by almost everybody, right? And that certainly has an impact on political culture. So to wrap up here, quick summary. U.S. political culture fosters civic duty. Civic duty is important, but how it looks might be changing. It requires that we have courts that uphold our constitutional protections and support civil liberties. Political equality is an important value where economic equality is not. And we also recognize that we have an adversarial political system, meaning we're not going to reach the end goal through consensus. No, we're going to reach the end goal through public debate with each other, public disagreement. That's how we're going to get public policy. It's not going to be all butterflies and roses, and we're okay with that. So that's a wrap. Have a great rest of your day.